well, this is the June meeting of our general meeting of the Diamond Valley Writers Guild. And I start as I usually do. Is there anybody who has had a success with any writing recently? And I can see everybody, so you can raise your hand either by pushing the little thing under, is it under participants or wherever?
I thought it was.
And or you can just raise your hand like Ellen was doing, and I saw Ellen. And so in this case, I can unmute Ellen. And Ellen?
Okay, well, after 7 long years of writing, my book is published. So it's a memoir, it's on Amazon. It's called Grateful for the Color Blue, Surviving the Loss of an Adult Child. And I'm so excited, and I've been getting really good feedback. So it's very scary putting yourself out there personally, but I've been getting really, really nice feedback. So I feel great.
All right, great.
Congrats.
Yes.
So I can't hear anything.
Yeah, Jim, you were muted.
Everything was muted. Jim, you're muted. Can't hear. Jim, you're muted.
I just hope he's recording all this.
Let's all raise our hands.
Jim, you're muted. We cannot hear you.
Okay.
There, we cannot hear a single word you said. Jim.
Muted.
Okay, I don't know why it was muted. Am I okay now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else have anything else to say?
By the way, we didn't hear anything you said after Ellen spoke. So if you said anything after Ellen spoke, we heard not a word of it.
Actually, I thought Greg had his hand up and wanted to say something.
That's all he said.
Oh, that's all he said. So I was
think that's
muted.
what he was
Okay. Well, in that case, let's move on to something else at this spot. And it will be Sandy.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I thought I would do a little something on prologues this morning. Some people skip them, some people skim them, and some people read them. Myself, I'm a cover-to-cover woman, so I always read them, and I'm not bothered by them at all. But there is a bit of pessimism about using prologues. But like anything, if they are well written and with a purpose, they're an integral part of setting your novel up to be a successful story. Usually, the prologue introduces important information beyond background details, and it has characters and some connection to the main story. And it helps readers understand the story. And there are 3 common prologue types: action, frame, or teaser. The action we often see with thrillers and mysteries, and you'll see that even in TV series and so forth. It offers a scene, usually involving a death. It sets up tone and stakes with some kind of trouble. Something bad happens or is about to happen. In a framing story or prologue, it gives readers a view of a character about to look back and tell the story. And a famous one Of course, is Romeo and Juliet. It tells what's going to happen. But also, To Kill a Mockingbird did when Harper Lee says Macomb was an old town, and it's an absolutely beautiful, short introduction to how Scout is going to go back in time. Or she's talking present day, and then she's going to tell the story after that. Where the Crawdads Sing had a very short 3-paragraph one, as I recall, which really would get people into wanting to find out who that body was, why that body was there, and so on. And the teaser is a highly charged scene from the story, and it stops short of resolution. That's not one I'm particularly fond of, because it takes something out of the middle of the story, puts it as a prologue, and then it leads you up to that, and it's repeated from that point. So, like with virtually anything we do, an effective prologue has to be well written. Typically, it should be short, relevant to the story, and foreshadow or affect events to come. Ineffective prologues are too long, flat out info dumps, or sounds like an essay, and has little, if anything, to do with the story. The good prologue is short, well written, and offers us something to really get into it. So if you're writing, ask yourself, do I need a prologue? And consider answering these questions. What information am I providing in the prologue? Why is it important to reveal it up front? Can it be revealed throughout the story in smaller trickles and still be impactful? Would this work better as a first chapter instead? Because one of the biggest criticisms of prologues is its 2 beginnings. What does the reader absolutely need to know before starting to read the main story? And does the prologue improve my story? So in closing, consider how prologues might be like appetizers. Written well, the prologue prepares the reader for the main course, while a poorly written prologue ruins your appetite for the novel.
Okay, thanks, Sandy. Anybody have a question you want to ask Sandy? No? All right. I would like to add that one of my favorite novels has a prologue but doesn't call it that. And it's by Edith Wharton, Ethan Frome, which has it's a frame story. It's the classic frame story. If you've never read it, it'll take you all of about an hour and a half. It's a very short novel. If you've not read it, it's one of the great American novels, and it has in the frame, there is a twist at the end that is startling and yet absolutely logical. So in that case, and I'm with Sandy. I read for myself. I read the prologues, forwards, acknowledgments. I try to read it all.
Yes, I read the whole shooting match.
The whole shebang. All right.
Yep.
Oh, I have a question. Yes, from Ellen. You're muted, Ellen.
There we go.
I have to get you on.
Andy, the difference between a preface and a prologue, do you have that info?
Yes. A preface is usually, a preface is for a nonfiction book. And it is often written from the point of view of the author, not a character or narration, obviously. And it explains the origins, development, legacy, or aims of the book, and who contributed to it. It acknowledges others, which is why it's mainly nonfiction. Same thing for a foreword. That's usually a nonfiction book, but it's written by a critic or a subject matter expert.
Yeah, I'd like to add one thing about the preface. There are occasionally fiction books will have prefaces. I have a copy of The Leopard by Lampedusa, and there's a preface, but it's a preface by somebody else who's writing about the book itself, how it came to be, about the Lampedusa family and how its relationship was to the actual characters in the novel. So it's a preface that way. So occasionally, as Sandy said, occasionally fiction will have it, and it only adds information to the creation of the book, essentially, or something about the author, something of that sort. But mainly, yeah. But prefaces are interesting, and I've always found them worth reading.
If they're in a book, I read the preface, I read forewords, I read introductions,
And afterwards,
dedications.
yeah, dedications, afterwards, and historical notes, everything. Okay, next we want to go to Cheryl, and she has wants to tell us about straitjackets.
Yes, I do. Oh, okay.
You're
All right. So we have a deadline coming up of July 15th for the summer issue that we're going to try to put out. And what I'd like to do, we've gotten several submissions so far, and I would like to encourage people, we would like to hear some new voices also. And so if there are writers that have not submitted, they're afraid or they don't think their submission would be worth it, it's a start, because as the editors, we try to look at and encourage something and give feedback. For those of you who are parts of writing groups, if there's something that comes across really well in your writing group, if that can also be considered a possible submission. We would like to, for those of you who are published authors, we'd like to encourage maybe choosing an excerpt from something that you've written as to add variety to the magazine. And let's see what else. I think that's about it. We would like to just encourage you to keep writing. We love what we get. And we're trying to throw the fishnet out there to get, to see if we can't encourage more folks that have not submitted before to submit or to resubmit or do something like that.
all right.
Ellen,
Anything
do you have
else?
anything? Well, I want to see if Ellen has anything she'd like to add.
No, we're just excited. If you haven't looked at the last issue, you can pull it up. You can find it at straitjackets.org, and it's STRAIT, named after Rusty Straight. But we're just always excited when the editors get together. We have a lot of fun reading your work and doing a little editing if necessary. So again, just to reinforce what Cheryl said, we encourage you to give it a try. Give it a try. Looking forward to reading your writing.
All right. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Next on the agenda, Michelle wants to discuss our next meeting in July.
Good morning, everybody. Oh, you can't say anything. That's right. You're all muted. I forgot. So I have been appointed the person to organize next July, or the July meeting coming up at the end of the month, because what we had planned was a round table at the library, where probably some of you remember last year, people moved from table to table, from topic to topic. Well, that isn't going to happen for obvious reasons. So instead, I'm going to try to make this as much audience participation as possible. But what we came up with, and I was, as I said, appointed to do, was first lines. They're very important. They're the hook. They're what pulls in your reader, what hopefully gets your book sold to an editor, sells yourself to an agent. So first lines, openings of novels, of short stories. So I invite everyone to do a little research in the next 30 days and come up with one or two, either from your own writing or from your favorite novel or short story that you would like to share next month. And I want to limit it to no more than a paragraph. If it's a really long paragraph, don't read it. We're going to try to keep everything 1-2 lines, a first paragraph, just an opening hook, and then have a discussion on each one as to, does it work? Does it not work? Why did you pick that one? And I'll have a little short opening regarding first lines and the importance of them and how it's looked at with the industry. So that's it. It should be kind of fun. I've got a stack of books I've already been going through, and I've enlisted the help of my son and daughter, and they've been handing me books going, read this one, read this one, read this one. So I'm kind of researching now, and we'll do that next month. I'll send out more information with the announcement from Diamond Valley Writers Guild as it gets closer, outlining again the rules, but try to keep it to a paragraph or less, preferably first, second sentences if you can, the more succinct, the better. Any questions? Can you mute everybody to see if there's any questions real quick?
Okay, Dennis. Hold on, Dennis.
You're muted.
He's unmuted.
Yeah, I just wondered whether or not you want any nonfiction, fiction, nonfiction examples of first lines. That's all.
I don't see where there'd be a problem with that. Yeah, I was thinking in terms of fiction, but hey, if you've got something you think is a great hook, bring it in.
Yeah, I would just adding on that, I would think that first lines are important in nonfiction too, because you're still trying to grip the reader and bring the reader in. So, when my nonfiction books that I wrote, I was trying to get something right off the bat, a hook, a line, an idea that would draw people in. And so I think that's just as important as a fiction book.
I agree. Also, if you have read a book that you thought had a horrible opening, I've read some of those. First line, you're going, why? First paragraph, it's like you didn't even get until page 20 anything that was worthwhile. Bring that in too. We're not going to slam writers, but it'd be interesting to see what doesn't work, what you felt as a reader did not really work, and did you or did you not finish that novel based on that? That's the other question. So kind of a discussion thing, as well as a little bit of some information up front, and then mostly participatory, because that's what I like.
Okay. Anything else? All right. Well, in that case, next on the agenda is Howard. You're unmuted, Howard.
Okay. Well, I am so darn excited. Really excited.
Ooh.
On August 22nd, we have the 5th annual poetry event for the Diamond Valley Writers Guild. I never thought 5 years ago that we would ever get to this point. And it's gotten better each year from my point of view. And we have some great poets, not only in the writers group, but in this area. I think when our civilization crumbles and archaeologists and anthropologists go through the ruins, they're going to say, in Riverside County, we're finding there's a lot of great poets for some reason. And they have a lot of citrus and they have a lot of great poets. We can't quite get the connection, but they'll ponder it. They'll write dissertations about it. But we will know that we have great poets on August 22nd. So if anybody wants to contribute their poetry or read a poem that you've already written in the past and you've read it in the past, bring it again. You know how much we like to hear Dr. Seuss over and over. So even though you've read your poem before, read it again. I know I do. I always do the same poem and at the end. So it's a joy. And poetry is so wonderful. It's one of the highest forms of communication. And to have one day or 1 month out of the year dedicated to it is a real blessing. So I urge all of you, if you haven't written any poetry, to get a couple of poems ready. We allow 2 poems You can read one or two, and we do have an exception, and that is the haiku exception. 'Cause as you know, haiku only has 3 lines. So if you only read 2 haiku, it would only be 6 lines. You would be cheated out of more lines that other poets take for granted. So last year, I think we had 6 haiku as the limit. And this year, we're expanding it to 8 haiku. So we do have some great haiku writers, and they'll be happy to know that they can at least have 24 lines this year. So does anybody have any questions about the poetry?
Okay, just a personal question, Howard. Who's your favorite poet?
Me. I'm my favorite poet.
Good answer.
And you know, and the one thing that's so wonderful about poetry is that, and why I think it's the highest form of communication, is that it conveys emotion. And the poet is the bravest writer of all, because they put themselves emotionally out there to the public. And we love what they do, but they take the risk of being, of having their emotions on their paper. And I think they're not only brave, but it's wonderful to have people like that who will share emotion. And I know from past events, some of the poems have been so touching and so interesting and so unusual. So I look forward to that aspect of it. And of course, we're going to have an introductory discussion of poetry. Last year, we discussed the poetry of Bob Dylan, and he was a poet before he was a singer. And we also discussed ancient Sanskrit poetry, which was really delightful from my point of view. We discovered that John Steinbeck had Sanskrit poetry, ancient Sanskrit poetry in Cannery Row. Who would have thought? And we listened to a song in Sanskrit. So the people who attended got to hear some real Sanskrit spoken. I'm still humming it in the shower. So these unusual things can come up in the course of a poetry event, and I'm looking forward to it.
All right, thanks, Howard. Always a great.
Ellen.
Yeah, Ellen, you have.
I'm chatty this morning. So I just wanted to, speaking of poetry, David White, the poet, W-H-Y-T-E, has been doing a series of 3 Sunday talks. He's starting another one in July. I think it's the second Sunday in July. But if you go to his website, David White, W-H-Y-T-E, or Many Rivers is also his name. I've done 2 months of these, and they're extraordinary. So I will just put that out to you.
Okay, and one more thing. If you have decided you'd like to participate, let me know, because I like to have a little schedule of who's going to recite the poetry. And it's good to know how many speakers we're going to have. And my email is my last name, feigenbaum@sbcglobal.net. And Lynn will put an announcement on the website. But it's just like it sounds, feigenbaum@sbcglobal.net.
And when I've sent out a notice to everybody, Howard, I'll try to remember to put that on the notice too for that.
Okay.
Okay. Anybody have anything else about Howard? Well, in that case, I'm going to move to Dennis. And Dennis, would you like to introduce our speaker for today?
Yes, I would, but I have an announcement also that
Okay.
relates to the idea of Southern California Christian Writers Conference. It is coming up in July on the 8th, 9th, 10th. And what will happen at that point is there's going to be free keynotes. So anybody who would like to tune into the keynote can research Southern California Christian Writers Conference and be able to take advantage of opportunity there to listen to some keynote presentations that are at a writers conference. The conference is $100 at the low level, and then they have other more advanced level, but anybody interested in that might be find that to be interesting, tuning into that. The other thing is, I'll just go ahead and move right immediately to introducing our speaker today, Rebecca Farnbach. She's a great speaker, and I've heard her speak at a historical society. But I want to tell you a little bit about her background so you have a context for that. If you can imagine, in Temecula, there are a lot of people who could be Citizen of the Year. Her and her husband, Daryl, have been working on the Vail Ranch restoration. If you've never been there, it's very interesting to visit down in South Temecula. They won Citizens of the Year for 2020 from the Chamber of Commerce. She's also been a noted writer as Writer of the Year for the San Diego Christian Writers Guild. Her 6 books in the Images of America, you might have seen those kinds of books. There are a lot of pictures in them, but they have captions that capture the whole idea of historical cities. And so with her 6 books there, she's also written poetry and prose. And the other thing that I found interesting is she started her career when she was just 17. And as a 17-year-old, she wrote an article for 17 magazine. And that ended up being her first publication. And then she wrote some things. And you may be involved or familiar with the WIC program that helps women with infants. That whole program, she ended up writing a recipe book as well. So she got her early start at that point to be able to allow her to continue writing. She has a couple of projects that she's working on right now that have been put on hold due to the coronavirus. But one has to do with Temecula wineries and the tastes of the wineries, and the others are pictures of the wineries. So she's got two books forthcoming. And I just want to say that you can look her up on Amazon and be able to find more references to her work. But just be aware that Rebecca provides a wealth of information for us all. And I just want to go ahead and allow you to silently go ahead and applaud here so you can. Thank you, Rebecca. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to meet you all and to share what I know. And I want to thank Dennis for making arrangements to invite me. And Karen, I have to acknowledge you. Karen and I have known each other for over 30 years. And when I wasn't doing very much publishing at all, she was an inspiration to me. So Karen, thank you. And I would also like to mention someone whose face we don't see, but you see C-A-D-Y, that's Cheryl Cady from the Temecula Valley Historical Society. She's tuning in. So hello, and it's great to be here. Now, to put me in context, why do we care about history? Why do we care? And I am also a poet, and if you were to look at my body of work, you would see that I have both the historic and I also have poetry. But I'm going to read to you a very short poem that I wrote that shows how poetry is also a way of writing history. The reason I'm sharing this initially during this session is because it puts the concept into your minds of why history matters. And I'll tell you before I read the poem why it matters. We are part of a river, a continuum of history of all people who have ever lived in all parts of the world. We are a part of the stream. And if we can understand that, then we can understand our world better and we can know who we personally are, we, the one grain of sand that we are. So my poem is called At Dusk, and a subtitle to it is To My Ancestors. I was pondering one day about my ancestors, and here's what I came up with. And you must also understand that career-wise, I was an optician, so that is factored in too. Peering through a telescope, spanning miles and time and the sea, only your outline is visible, your name, some dates, locality. I look not to space nor deep within, but I strain my eyes to see you who lived before automobile, plane, machine. Did you smile at opening bud, the trill of a lark, the squeal of a child, Did God press himself on your heart before ink and type struck page? Did you entwine in youthful love to add lives to our chain? Did you a spyglass fix on me and find the glint of love my heart sends now to thee? And that ends the poem. Thank you. Thank you very much. But it describes how we are part of the continuum of history, and that's why history matters to me. I love the theme that Dennis developed, bringing history to life. You know, in school, history was taught in a very boring fashion. It was like this list of dates and this, you know, events and so on that we were supposed to do rote memory of. But what we missed out on was the romance and the stories behind all of those events and dates. So our job, if we are to write history, is to interject those really tantalizing things that make you want to know the people, be at the event, and love what was happening then. You know, we have moments in our lives today when we sit back and enjoy good music, good friendship, wonderful food, a glass of delightful wine, and it's just a moment. Well, we can go into moments in the past and be a spectator by allowing our imaginations to be present there. And that's one of the beauties of reading. And as a writer, we can take other readers there. So I'd like to tell you that good writers can infuse boring topics with joy if we understand and look at the events and people and settings from different perspectives. I like to think of us as writers as being mainly observers who have an acute awareness of understanding what we are observing, whether it is in the moment when we're out for a walk and we hear the trill of the bird and think of our ancestors who also delighted in the trill of a bird, when we hear our grandbabies squealing, and we think about all through history, all the people who have enjoyed the laughter of a child. And so we can put it on the page to give others that experience. But we can also do that in the telling of another story. So instead of just the dull, undelightful facts and figures, we put in what I call candy. So we can give a few facts, but we can also introduce irony and humor and universal truths that help people connect to the story. Now, before I go on with this, I want to mention, you know, we can do historic fiction. I don't talk about historic fiction. I'm not skilled in historic fiction. I am more, as I said, the observer that infuses the cold, dry facts with something delightful. Now, there are, in nonfiction history writing, you have a narrative style, which is my voice mainly, or you have a journalistic style. The journalistic style is more, this is the way it was, it happened this way, but you can also infuse those elements of humor, irony, and quick little observations without changing into that narrative voice. I have a few examples that I'm going to be reading to you in a couple of minutes of my own work where I have done that. But let's go over some of the basics first. In compelling nonfiction history, whether it is in the historic fiction or, historic nonfiction in a narrative way or in a journalistic way, you want to organize your writing in a way that has an arc of tension. You want to open each chapter or scene with a question that begs to be answered. And by the end of your piece, you need to answer it in a satisfying way or in a satisfying question that is unresolved at the end. Also, I should say it's important to select a topic that is of interest to people. The principle of universality is people can relate to that. There are certain aspects of human life that everyone can relate to. An example would be the feel of mud between the barefoot toes, the alluring blue sky with white fluffy clouds. So images that appeal to everyone's senses of something they have personally experienced. Fiction is always written so that it's a believable storyline. But nonfiction, and in the telling of history, it should be written in a way that you remark upon, that's just unbelievable. There's something about it that it's like, wow, how could that happen? Or how could that happen that way? As I said, to write history is to do a time travel. And I think that's a pleasant feeling. It's like transcending the today. You can go back and really truly understand. Nonfiction history can be written in the form of memoirs, biographies, autobiographies, and even poetry, as you heard a little piece of mine. And what I'd like to do now is to, I'm going to be a little bit piecemeal here, but bear with me. Dennis had mentioned the Images of America books. This was a really fun project that Loretta Barnett and I did. And as you know, they're just, you wouldn't consider them very literary, but it was like a game. If any of you like crossword puzzles and so on, this was like a game because we were allowed 40 words for each caption. And you need to tell the story from front to back of the book in 40-word captions. So, and then we tried to do every page opening to be related to one another. So that was fun. All right. I am going to go on. I had a script I was going to read, and Dennis told me I do much better when I talk freely. So at this point, what I'm going to do is go through, this is a little book I put together of some of my best work. And in it is the poem that I read at the beginning. I want to give you an example also, Howard, for opening lines and for resolution at the end of a work. So I'm coming back to that topic. So I'm going to give you an opening paragraph, and then I'm going to read you the last paragraph in a piece. And this is a short story article. Why do we write history? For myself, it was because when my husband and I were championing the Vail headquarters historic site, I needed to write the narrative for the county of Riverside, who we were suing, to understand why that historic district was important. So we amassed all of this important information, and I needed to put it in a readable fashion. So I started putting together history of that place. So this little piece that was later published in the Historical Society newsletter is called Setting the Stage for the Vails, and the Vails were a family. Okay, now what I'm telling you here is I'm opening with kind of an arc of suspense, and then you'll see how I end it. Tract homes and shopping centers spring up where names like Red Hawk, Vail Ranch, and Wolf Road reveal layers of the past that are hidden from the view. An historic ranch headquarters, once the seat of financial power and influence in the Temecula Valley, was also obscured for a while, but is now open to the public as a park-like retail center. So I'm setting the stage. Wonder why it was not visible for a while, right? And I go in to talk about Lewis Wolf, who was the first person who lived there and who built an Adobe store, and how he had wanted to make a tract home city out of Temecula back in the 1880s. Joke, right? And now I'm ending with Wolf is buried on a hilltop plot, which is now just one obscure lot in a tract of homes. If he were to awaken from his mortal sleep and look from atop his ornate grave monument, he would probably smile to see his dream of Louisville, almost as far as his eyes could see. Then he would check his pockets to see if he had riches. He might shield his eyes to look through the misty valley sunshine toward the northeast to see the Wolf Store adobe still standing. Every trace of the Apish adobe and the surrounding Indian village is gone, except for a raised mound of earth, the old Indian cemetery, a reminder of early days in Temecula Valley. So we start out with a history piece with an introduction of what we're going to say, and then we finish it off and kind of repeat what we have said for the sake of the reader. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example now of a journalistic style writing of history. I don't know if many of you are familiar with a Orange County civil rights case with schools. There was a court case in 1954 where Earl Warren and Thurgood Marshall were helping Hispanic people receive equal educational rights for their children as Anglos were. So here's how I start that article, and this is very journalistic style. We are all familiar with the African-American fight for civil rights in the 1960s, but most are not aware of the important case for integration of schools in Orange County that set a precedent for Brown versus Brown at the Board of Education in the United States Supreme Court. This early case featured two of the players who were later part of the famous Supreme Court case. An African-American lawyer named Thurgood Marshall filed a brief on behalf of the NAACP in Orange County to allow Mexican-American children to attend school with Anglo-American children. He later successfully argued the landmark case of Brown versus the Board of Education before the Supreme Court in 1954 using the Orange County case as a model. Okay, so what I did there is you just got the facts, but what you got was the tantalizing, hey, this is important not just because of what happened in Orange County, but because it's a precedent to something greater that happened across the entire United States. Okay, so I wanted to show you that. Then I want to I want to share with you my personal voice, my personal style of doing a narrative fiction. This is the opening paragraph for telling, it's an article about the Hotel Temecula, which is an old historic hotel in Old Town. And I'm engaging the senses when you see what I wrote here. The aroma of fresh peach pie and cinnamon embraced us as we crossed the worn threshold into Laverne's parlor. Laverne escorted us in past the old hotel desk, mailboxes, and the original 1899 guest register. The year was 2000. My husband and I had an appointment to see her treasured photo collection. So I think that that's a warm and inviting scene. It's history that we're talking about and are going into in this article, but you're invited in with the senses, with the aroma of the warm peach pie and the cinnamon. And with the worn threshold, you get the feeling you're an observer as a reader in the, going into that space and time. Okay. It's funny that we were talking about opening lines, and that's what I had prepared to talk about today too. Here's another opening line. See if this is engaging for talking about history and wanting people to read about, quote, boring history. The title is A City Gone Mad, New Orleans After Katrina from a Policeman's Eyes. Nothing in Sean Keaveney's previous life prepared him for the chaos of the streets of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and the breaching of the levees. Not his military training, his combat experience, nor his prior experiences as a New Orleans police officer gave him any tools to cope with the world gone wrong in the aftermath of the disaster. So that's another hope of enticing the reader to come in to the story. Here's another one, and this is a story about one of Earl Stanley, it's a biography piece on one of Earl Stanley Gardner's secretaries. My title is Writing Her Own Story. When Mildred Paulson Stiles moved to the Temecula area from Iowa in the fall of 1946, she was not just leaving the Midwest to escape another icy winter. She came to Southern California to warm her heart from the unexpected death of her 5-year-old son and the chill it cast on her stale marriage. She set her eyes on a new climate to reclaim her own life, moving in with her parents and brother, and wondering how she would be able to support herself with her 2 children. With no skills or work experience, she decided there was only one thing to do. She would drive up to the neighboring author's ranch and ask for a job. So in that paragraph, I've used a few literary conventions, and one was the contrast of the warmth of Southern California versus the cold of the Midwest, and connecting it to the coldness of her heart in the situation in the Midwest to the warmth that she expected for herself and her remaining 2 children in California. And then I leave that question, how was this going to work out? And you got somewhat a cliffhanger at the end of that first paragraph when it says she would drive up to the neighbor's ranch and ask for a job. So you see in this, I'm taking that tone of a narrator. I'm not taking the tone that I did when I was talking about the court case in Orange County. Instead of just the facts, man, just the facts, and interweaving a few delectable pieces like Thurgood Marshall and Earl Warren were parts of that, which, you know, is a connecting thing to engage the intellect and emotions to that story. I'm putting emotion into Mildred Stiles's story, but that's history, nonfiction. Here's another first line. I met a guy when I was working as an optician who sat across the optician desk from me and said, you know, somebody ought to write my story sometime. So I took care of business with him. And then I said, I'm a writer. I'd like your phone number. I'll get in touch with you. And out of it came a wonderful story that was amazing. And here's how I began it. Temecula resident remembers 3 years as Korean POW on 50th anniversary of his release. First paragraph. Bad luck followed Harry Adesso from the time he was born, but he never gave up and never lost hope. Born in New York City and abandoned by his parents as a small child, Harry was raised in an orphanage. After graduating from high school in 1948, he signed up for Uncle Sam's Army to make some money and tour the world. He kissed his girlfriend goodbye and took a seat on his first ever train ride and headed across the country to Los Angeles, where military transport took him for commando training in northern Japan. So what I've attempted to do there is to bring you in as a reader by getting your heart connected to poor Harry, who has had bad luck all of his life, and you know, but he never lost hope. So his story goes that he got over to Japan and he broke his leg first thing and suffered as a prisoner of war, horrible, horrible things. And I detail that, and came home and his girlfriend had married somebody else. So I end with, Harry says he has no regrets that he enlisted in the Army. After all, he did have an adventure. He traveled and met a lot of interesting people. He says he considers each day a bonus day that he might not have had. When asked where he acquired the strength of character to suffer torment and starvation as a POW, he said, I always knew God was with me and that everything would turn out right. So there's your satisfying conclusion. So again, do you see how in fiction and nonfiction, there are certain components that are satisfying to readers? And certainly the lead in with a question or an inferred question, how is this going to resolve, is present in telling history. And that's something I haven't heard anybody else ever teach, but it's something that I just know works. Here's another such example. This is a more lengthy article called Timeless Temecula, and it's in 3 different sections. And in the section called The Birth of Isabel Gonzalez, here's the first paragraph. A weary doctor delivered Isabel Grace Gonzalez, the first non-Indian female born in the wilds of Temecula to stay for a lifetime. The doctor was recovering from tuberculosis and had just buried his year-old daughter on a hillside overlooking the fledgling settlement. Attending the birth of such a healthy baby encouraged him, and he wrote euphorically to relatives in New York State, saying he had just made it in time to deliver the pretty and plump baby girl. The name of the doctor and the site of his child's grave have vanished through the years, but the healthy baby Isabel lived on, and because of her, we have a good picture of what Temecula was during her lifetime. And then I go on to tell about her lifetime and so on, but that's the lead in for that. And I think that explaining a universal truth of sorrow, we all experience sorrow at some time in our lives. We can get into the eyes and ears and hands of the doctor who delivered Isabel, and we can understand the emotions. And that's what being a narrator of history is about. Again, I just want to emphasize, if you're writing history, you examine it, you ponder it, you look at it from different points of view. You don't just read something about history and write it. You have to process it. You have to live with it for a while. It has to foment inside you before you can write it. Here's a middle of a passage of one of my works. If we step lightly and listen carefully, we can find traces of the past in and around Temecula. Some say ground along the Butterfield Trail in Awanga still holds scars of wagon ruts from the Butterfield stages, and a person can still visit the Dripping Springs watering hole at Vail Lake Resort. Sometimes an arrowhead, grinding rock, or potsherd turns up after a fire or heavy rain, but we have few reminders of the ancient past in Temecula, but many from the era of Bessie's lifetime, and that's Isabel Barnett, who I just read about, the one who was delivered by the sorrowful doctor. So this is part of that article. So my background as a poet and an observer is infusing life and understanding and engaging the reader with something as, quote, dull as history. And I think that's my main message to you, but I'm going to read you another example. This is a first paragraph of a story. Well, it's called A Desperate Journey to Temecula in 1905. It was December 14th, 1905 in Hilt, California on the Oregon border. Mary Goodman had baked bread and prepared a good dinner for her husband Fred and their 5 children. But Fred came home drunk and quarrelsome. Fred, who was handicapped after losing his left arm in a railroad accident, was a frustrated man. He still had a job with the railroad, but he would get drunk, and his family was terrified by his violence. That cold December night, he returned to the saloon, spewing threats of what he would do to his family when he returned. So that's the opening line, and then I tell the story. So you wonder, a question that I would have if I were listening to this talk is, how much license do you take in what you're saying happened? Well, I read a firsthand account by the oldest daughter of that woman who made the trip in 1905. The daughter was like 12 years old during that trip. She wrote what happened. And I have read every account written about that and interviewed probably 4 different people about that story. So I understand. And by the way, the satisfying, although very sad, resolution to that story is, after that family made it, it took 6 weeks to come with 2 horses, 1 wagon, 1 dog, 4 children, and a woman alone in December of 1905. They got down to Temecula, where they landed in the home of an aunt and uncle. The mother fell apart from all the nervous anxiety. The man came after them. The aunt and uncle said, "You got to get out of here. You don't belong here." He went back up to Hilt, California, and died drunk, face down in a puddle. So anyway, it's not a happy, a pretty story, but that is a resolution. We tell the resolution of it. So some of the points that I was going to cover, where to find the historic information. So, these days it's easy to find historic information on the internet. And you can find newspaper articles, but those aren't your best. Anybody has access to that. When you're writing history, you want to be the ultimate expert on what you're telling about, what you're writing about. So you need to go to the places where it happened. You need to observe. I'm using that word observe. You need to be an observer. You need to feel it, smell it, taste it, see what your eyes see when you're standing where the person was. You need to meet people who've known the people or who were at the event. If you can't know them because too much time has passed, look up their family. Invite yourself over to the house and go through their photo albums. That way you can see what those people saw. Listen to what stories they carried down through the family. Now, with Lewis Wolfe knowing that he wanted to draft tract homes, that's well known. It's documented. There's even a map of how he wanted to put his tract homes out. So that was easy. But I had to see everything written about Lewis Wolfe. I had to see if there were any descendants left. I found a few. And I had to look at every photograph before I could really get into his head and know who he was and represent him in a fair way on paper. So my best resource is to go to the site when I can and to meet the people if I can, to see everything I can. Now, for a while I was researching a distant family member. It culminated with a little booklet that I did. The family, the branch of the tree was an American family who went as early missionaries to India. I was doing the research between 1993 to 2003. And in those days, we didn't have so many resources online. So I would go to the library. I found everything that had ever been written about that family and got it from interlibrary loan, and honestly copied at 15 cents a page entire books. So I would have that as a resource while I was putting together the story. I thought I was going to write historic fiction. I'm not talented as a fiction writer. My thing is, I am too, I say, efficient with words. I'm not one who can go on and on about the flowery and I don't like to use lots of words. I'm more of a nonfiction writer because I like to be efficient with my words. I like to use words that give meaning, because bottom line, I'm a poet. And I bring my poetry into my prose nonfiction narrative. So anyway, my historic fiction never flew. I wrote 4 different versions of it, turned down by everybody, and I'm not going to self-publish it because I don't think it's good enough. So somebody heard about me from a Baptist church in Providence, Rhode Island, and they said, our church is named the James Phillips Memorial Church, and we heard that you know about him. So I published this little thing with Kindle Direct Publishing, and it's the story of his life. Okay, so I wanted to tell you on this one. Oh, okay, so first of all, my point was, I was telling you where I gathered all my resources, interlibrary loan, plus I personally inherited a ton of personal correspondence that was written over a 100-year period of time between those family members, and diaries from their stay in India, and letters back and forth to America to tell their story. But how much can we take liberty with when we're writing historic nonfiction? So here's 2 paragraphs, actually the beginning of the story again, opening paragraphs. When James Liddell Phillips's first cry pierced the tense room, there was most likely a sigh of relief from the midwife, from the weary laborer, and from those waiting outside the door. James was born in a jungle land teeming with life, but one that could be brutal to humans. Perhaps the joyful scene was interrupted by surprise when Marianne groaned again and birthed a second son, who joined the squalling song of James. I can imagine their father standing outside, stopping his pacing to listen more carefully. Was it 1 baby, or glory to God, 2? Yes, indeed, 2 wonderful squalling babies. So did he actually say those exact words? Pretty much so. I've thrown in a little bit of interpretation with the first cry piercing the tense room. I imagine it was tense, and the sigh of relief from the midwife, and the sigh of relief from the woman who had just given birth, and from those waiting outside. And then I put in the poetic reference to born in a jungle teeming with life, but brutal to humans. And that's an irony there. And then the interruption of the second son, the twin being born. So I tried to do that in a very interesting, readable fashion to engage the reader in what could be a very boring history. You could say, James Liddell Phillips had a twin brother, John, born seconds after him. But no, infuse life into this. And I kind of know what the father's reaction was because I have some personal letters that he did say, oh, to our amazement, there was a second child born. So that's that point. So when can we insert things like that? I'm kind of a purist, and I don't like to say that historic characters say something unless they really did, or it's in, if it's like something they would have said, like something that we know that they have said. I don't really like it when people take Bible characters and then they make a whole fiction story out of it. I'm real wary of that because I feel like, how do they know and what right do they have to change somebody's story? And the same with any kind of historic fiction. We need to be very, very careful. And in historic nonfiction, we also need to be careful We can change that person into someone totally different if we put ourselves instead of what we really know that they have said. So that's my point in how to resolve, or how to know how much we can interpret. Be solid, be solid. You should be rock solid. If somebody else who knows the history almost as well as you comes and confronts you, you should be able to stand up for it and say, nope, this is true. How to resolve differences in narratives. So another story is that, how many of you have ever stopped by Vail headquarters? Raise your hand if you've been to Vail headquarters. Okay, so Vail headquarters is an actual historic site in South Temecula next to Kohl's department store. And as part of the restoration process, we required every one of the buildings in that region to have a facade looking like ranching history. So it would be, it would blend with the ranch there. Kohl's said they would not depart from their traditional big box store, but they conceded that they would enlarge a historic photograph if we would supply them with one. So now on the site of Kohl's, there's this whole billboard of 7 cowboys, which the photograph, by the way, Earl Stanley Gardner took in 1947, September 19th, I think it was. And the photo was taken across the street where the Home Depot is now. And it's 7 actual cowboys on horseback who rode in, for the Vail Company. So the question was, how do you resolve differences? I wanted to identify each one of the men on horseback. There were 3 different accounts. The names didn't match. So you take and you make a list. This one says these names, 1 through 7. This one says these, and this one says these. Anything that all 3 accounts matched, I went ahead and used. There were some that 2 accounts matched. You take those to living survivors and ask them, who were these people? Sometimes they can't agree. So, and there were, on the 3 lists, there was one person that none of the 3 agreed. So again, you go to the living survivors and you do the best you can. And then we say that it's certain people, but there's a little waffle room with at least one of the people, in our opinion. But that's the best you can do. And you have to publish something, like I needed to post their names under the picture. And so we went with that, and that's the best we can do. Karen, you'll like this. Marvin Curran, who is the former fire captain in Murrieta, and I did a book together. And long times have passed since some of those events in the book. And I said, Marvin, are you sure about that? And he'd say, nobody else has lived this long in Murrieta. Nobody will know the difference. I said, Marvin, that's not good enough for me. But we had to joke about it. So that's a fun little thing about writing history. How to write the historic narrative. We talked about the format that you want to start out, and you want to do the arc of tension. If possible, every paragraph should have like a little cliffhanger to lead the reader to want to read the next paragraph. And to have the inviting first paragraph and then a resolution at the end. To read somewhat like a novel. Again, the principle is fiction should be so believable and nonfiction should be, how could that be true? Okay. How to organize historical material for enjoyable reading. That kind of goes right along with that. And then the last point is considering the audience in telling the stories. If I'm writing to 3rd graders for their 3rd grade curriculum, I'm going to really simplify and I'm going to make just certain points. If I'm writing for people who really don't care about the subject I'm writing about, but it's like in a magazine that needs to have an article about it, I will also just give the facts. I like to have no more than 5 facts that are take home. And I do think it's important to have take home value. You should have in mind what you want your readers or listeners to recall after they walk away from what you've written. And in that way, speak in a language that they understand. Speak in metaphors and idioms that is understandable to your audience. When you're talking to third graders, you simplify it. When you're talking to seniors, they have a depth of knowledge and experience, and they know more about a lot of things. When you're talking about the middlings, you kind of have to explain some of the things because they haven't seen it before. They haven't understood that concept before. So you go into a little bit more detail with them. Oftentimes, they say when you speak or write, you need to have one point that you want to take home. I think that's not enough. I think you need 3 to 5 points that you want to take home. So for you today, what I want you to remember for writing history or bringing history to life, don't silence your poetic voice. Use the power of imaging as an observer that you have observed, the things that pulled your heartstrings to make you involved with your story or with your true life character. Don't hold back on that. And you do that by use of active verbs and descriptive verbs. You don't have to add lots of words to do that. You do it like the doctor who delivered that baby. What did I say? He had a weary heart, you know, and just descriptions that are not judgmental. He said he had a weary heart. You know, he had just overcome tuberculosis. He had just buried his 1-year-old daughter. And so use those powerful words of description in a simple way to embed in the mind of the reader what your depiction of the scene is. Again, be a master of knowing what your scene or person is. Just know everything about it. Don't sit down and hastily write your narrative. Understand it first. If you don't understand it, it's like a school report that you wrote just because it was an assignment and you don't love it. Be careful what you write. Only take on what you really love, because then you can do a masterful presentation of it. And I think that's about it. So I am available for questions.
Okay. Any questions? While there people are thinking about questions they may want to ask, I want to say this. My own writing career, I started by writing for True West and Real West history.
Oh, great.
And the first article I wrote was on a prostitute in Bodie. And I structured it as earlier Sandy was talking about a frame story. I started it as a frame story, like it was fiction, with her death, and they're burying her in the cemetery. Went back and picked it up. So even though it was nonfiction, and that got reprinted in the best of the year for their magazine, even though it was nonfiction, I still saw it as a fiction story. And I think that the great history writers that I've read, and I have a master's in history, the great ones like Bruce Catton, for instance, or Doris Goodman, who wrote Team of Rivals recently, they write narrative history that is full of passion and full of certainly that driving kind of narrative that has an excitement to it just by moving along. And the people emerge as real people, not caricatures or anything of that sort. So, do we have any questions for Rebecca? Come on, must be some.
I can't see it.
I have a question.
All right, Cheryl has a question.
Yeah, hi Rebecca, that was great. What was the name of the story you told about Stanley Gardner's secretary, and where would I find that?
Okay, it was originally published in Valley News. I was doing a series of articles, and I have self-published a book called Dancing with Prayers in My Feet.
Okay.
And it's available on Amazon. And what I did is I collected some of my best articles in poetry and put in this volume, and it's part of it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay.
Howard has a question and Chuck has a question.
Okay, Chuck, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Howard. First of all, I want to commend you for writing history and reaching into the past and trying to make it accurate. One of the things about poetry and graffiti is probably what they'll find on the walls, history, by the way, Jim, is that there's often an agenda, and the agenda skews the facts and there's two things I like to kind of characterize it. There's things called true lies, where you tell a lie, but eventually it really is the truth. And there's things called lies, which are actually lies with an agenda. Kind of an interesting thing are the closing arguments in a court case, where both of the opposing attorneys use advocacy to describe the history of what occurred in the case facts. And so I really want to commend you for really digging into the past and really trying to figure out exactly what happened, good or bad.
Yes, thank you. I think we bear a responsibility to, okay, I'm not wanting to be persuasive in any way. When I write history, I just want to feel what was going on and to relay what was going on in a truthful manner. I don't have an agenda other than educating people. And you're so right, Chuck. We have to be careful when we read history to make sure that the writer doesn't have an agenda to try to be persuasive and to alter the true events or the outcome later. Absolutely.
Howard. Howard, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah, I enjoyed your talk, I wanted to say. And I began my writing career in the 7th grade with a historical poem, and it was called Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys.
Ooh.
And I grew up in upstate New York in the Catskill Mountains, and we had to learn Revolutionary War history. It was all over the place. And I especially liked heroes. So I wrote a poem, and it was published in the school newspaper. I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is wonderful. I'm a writer. And I was off and running. And then when I graduated college, I went to the University of Wisconsin, where I got a master's degree in American history. And I wrote a thesis on the pioneer lawyer in Wisconsin, which was published in the Wisconsin Magazine of History. But one of the things you said about finding out about the people touched me, because when I went into the archives that they had at the State Historical Society in Wisconsin, you could hold the letters that people wrote to each other about the concerns of their lives, or look at a newspaper, from 1860 or 1870, and see what they're talking about, and even what they're advertising, which I really enjoyed. They had a lot of fake stuff that wouldn't help you at all, just like they do today. And it was so wonderful to connect with people who were already gone and picture them as living beings who had the same struggles as any other people that you know. And it really does give you a better approach to writing about them.
Okay, can I have a moment?
Okay, my wife has a question or a moment.
You mentioned that, you know, in school, we did dates and things that would, and when I was in college, the most boring professor I ever had was, it was dates, and never related to the kids at all. And so when I taught, I wanted them to know about a period in time. And I was the one at the school that took the geography and the history and put it together, which nobody said I could do that. And the following year, the curriculum was, it made no sense to me for kids to hear about Japan and have no clue where that was. You know, it just didn't. So I tried to make it as, when we did Renaissance, we did newspapers. I mean, we did proactive stuff where kids had to find out things about the culture and what the practices were. So I tried my best as a teacher. I taught 7th grade all the way to 12th grade. And my goal was trying to not let them fall asleep and make them proactive.
Yeah, and one quick little caveat on that. My friend Jim Turner. Jim, raise your hand. There's Jim right there. Jim was a history teacher, and we taught together at the high school level for quite a few years. And Jim never taught by dates or anything. He taught history as an exciting story, and he was a terrific teacher. So there are teachers who will teach by dates and so forth. But I do believe there are those occasional teachers, and Jim was one of them. My wife was another, who saw beyond dates and saw that there were personal stories, and history was a living kind of thing rather than something that had occurred in the past. We're all still affected by what has happened in the past. And at any rate, that just
I taught at the continuation school when I first started teaching, and the guy that taught next to me was a master in history. I mean, the kids would come and tell me stories, so that meant they paid attention, and their attention span was almost non-existent. And I'd say, "How did you remember that?" But Bill would always clue in some kind of gory thing that happened. And these kids, that they would remember.
Yeah.
Anybody else have a, yes, Karen.
I just wanted to add, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, okay. I wanted to add a couple of things. So I thank you, Rebecca, for being here. I've heard some of your other stories and I appreciate that. But I just wanted to add that my husband was one of the last cowboys on the Vail Ranch, and the headquarters that they have restored was where he lived when we met, and we had some rather intimate moments there, but she didn't put that in her book. Anyway, but really another thing is, I hated history in school, but if you've never thought about writing quote unquote history, think about this. When Marvin Curran said, "Nobody's outlived me, so my word will be the last word," I made sure that before my parents passed away, I spent hours on the phone with my dad, having him tell me all of his experiences in the Second World War. My mother came and stayed with us, and for days, I just listened to her stories and asked her questions and wrote it all down. And I would encourage that's history, that's our history. And the really great part about it, Rebecca, is you don't have to be quite as correct. I mean, I'm not sending it to a publisher. My dad's, I did. I said it was published in a military magazine, but you don't have to be quite as careful because you're not sending it to a publisher, but your family is going to really appreciate that down the line. So I encourage people to do that.
And Dennis is next.
Okay.
Dennis, you had something. You had your hand up.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Unmute.
Okay, Dennis.
Yeah, oh, thank you. I wanted to ask a little bit about your ability to go ahead and at the end of every paragraph, make sure you got a cliffhanger. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that strategy that you've been able to kind of develop from introduction to, the resolution that you're trying to pull together at all times.
Well, it's like a discipline that you do when you're writing. And I think that it's done also in fiction. When you finish a scene, you want to give a little lead in to the next scene. So when you're doing a paragraph in history, you're also wanting to do a connecting thread to what you're going to tell next. So it can be either enticing or not, depending on how you use language. By using like questions that engage one's intellect regarding the universal experience of people, a mystery, a question of mystery, or just a thought, what comes next? But put it there in words to make it happen. And that's how you make that little cliffhanger or connective tissue. Like our bones are connected, it's the connective tissue between one part to another part for each paragraph.
Thanks.
Okay, my wife has another.
I couldn't have written my memoir if it wasn't for my mother. My mother's 104, and I would call her, well, I call her every day, first of all, but I would call her when I got stuck and I needed to know about, Uncle Jim or this person or that person. And it would never have gotten written if she hadn't been there to fill in the gaps for me.
Just a question. Do you believe that history is written by winners? I've heard that from other historians.
It doesn't have to be. It can be written about losers too. Written by losers too. So what we remember and what is taught is one thing. And I understand that principle that those who died, are not represented. But if we're very careful about how we're telling history, we want to remember everybody's story regarding it and to be fair. That's just kind of a personal bent I have because I want to tell stories with integrity. I think that some of the best stories are told about people who died tragically. Those are the most heartrending stories. I wish that everybody who'd ever lived would have something on Wikipedia or some database that we could know everybody's stories. I used to be on the Temecula Cemetery Board, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we had a little chip embedded into each of the tombstones that would tell that person's life story? That you could stand there with your smartphone and see a collage of photographs about that person's life, and a narrative if we wanted to. It'd be so nice. But yeah, I know that we are told that history is told by the victors in battle and that the losers are not, their stories not told. But let's find those stories and let's tell them.
Dan? You're muted, Dan. Just unmute yourself. It's okay.
He's dumb.
Where's Dan?
I don't know. Well, he must be.
Dan. Where's Dan?
I don't know.
Dan, there he is. Okay, Dan, you should be unmuted.
He's not.
Not unmuting himself.
You're not.
No.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself, Dan.
It's
Jim, can't you unmute him?
Yeah, I did.
Oh,
There he is. There he is.
okay.
Go, Dan.
No, he's not. What
No.
did you mute him again?
No, I didn't mute him
You're
again.
muted on your computer, Dan. You're
Okay, Dan. It
Go to
looks
somebody else's.
okay. Go to somebody else. All right, good for you,
Got
Dan.
it,
Thank
got
you.
it.
All right. In that case, let's see.
Cheryl, did you have?
Cheryl, did you have your hand up again?
I just had a comment to go along with Rebecca. but she ended it nicely. But I think that when they say that history is written by the victors, as an instructor, I want to throw the textbooks across the room because that's obviously written by the victors. But she made the point of finding the stories that aren't there. And like her, I'm a cemetery haunt, and I would stand in front of tombstones, and I would look at the dates, and I would wonder what was the life between the hyphens, of those dates. And it fascinates me. And I agree with you, Rebecca. I wish there was a chip in there because I think it's fascinating. And I read obituaries. And I save obituaries because those are the starts of stories or lifetimes, or I love it. I'm crazy. I love it. So that's it. Just a comment.
Dennis.
Karen and then Dennis. Karen?
I forgot what I was going to say.
Oh. Dan,
Oh, no, I know what I was going to say.
Judy.
When my sister and I are together, she oftentimes will tell a story about something that actually happened to me, and it's nothing like what happened to me. And so how do you depend on stories that are told and retold?
Okay, I have a formula for that too, and that is to tell both stories if you're writing it in a narrative. And you might say, this is so-and-so's account of what happened, but it's so-and-so says it was more like this, or, so tell both. That's a good point, actually, Karen. We get that in history. We get that, in fact, Jean and James Knott, who are from Murrieta.
Yeah,
they remember the same event and tell a different story and disagree with each other. And here they were brothers, they were both there, both heard the same things, observed the same things, but remembered it differently. And so we would tell both of their stories.
Interesting. Okay.
Is not audio working now?
I'll just add that there's an unusual cemetery in Los Angeles, Hollywood area. It's called Hollywood Forever Cemetery. And you actually can go on their website and people can have a legacy put there. And there are like war heroes that will have their whole story told in a video. And so this cemetery has actually provided that chip that you wanted in the headstone. And then there is a headstone at that place that was stolen, and it was Harry Burkhart, my great uncle, and he was hung in the state of California. And you can use the court cases to find the stories as they were summarized in one of the appellate courts. So there are wonderful stories out there, and you've kind of got me thinking about going back, and even you, Karen, to say, make sure that you tell these stories and don't let them get lost in the family. I don't know how many people want to hear about the guy who was hung in the state of California. But.
Yeah, no,
I do.
A lot of people are hung.
Okay, Dan, you got you're working now?
Yeah, there's so many variables in this Zoom thing. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for Rebecca for the nice talk. There is a historical aspect to the novel I'm writing, and I wanted to say to Karen too that picture at Kohl's of those cowboys was taken the day I was born. So that's speaking. So I'm pretty old now these days, realizing that when I went to school there wasn't history, so they didn't have it.
My husband was not in that picture.
I wonder if you would allow me to read one final poem to you, and it's a history poem, a nonfiction. Would you allow me?
Sure. Go right ahead.
Okay, and the title of this collection of articles and poems is called "Dancing with Prayers in My Feet," and it's based on a woman who I met, and you'll get her story as I read it. So you can write biography and nonfiction in poetry. The title is Dancing Louisa. When hawks excuse me, she's Native American, And you know, they were taken from their homes and put in boarding schools, right? And every bit of their culture was erased for a while. When hawks swooped to snatch children from their homes like eggs from nests, your grandfather sheltered his family with the coarsely woven blanket covering his shoulders. You walked together to freedom, from Arizona over tall mountain trails in the cold of winter to Colorado to make a new nest to survive the winds of change. He sold bundles of wood to ranchers and gradually learned their two languages to blend with their new neighbors. Your mother remembered the people of her village from the days before your long walk. She remembered grandmothers who danced with prayers in their feet, thankful for their goodly heritage, blessing the Creator for health and good life, and praying for their children. Your mother could not dance in the land over the mountains. She had forgotten how to dance with prayers in her feet. On Sundays, she took you to the hidden place in the mountains where women still danced and taught the young ones how to dance and pray. Your mother cried at the edge of the circle, saying, someday you would understand. And now, with 60 years behind you, you do understand. You dance and you dance with prayers in your feet, thankful for your mother and all of your grandmothers. You pray songs of thanks for your goodly heritage and for your children who live now and for those you will never see. When you dance, your face shines, and when you spread your arms, your shawl flies like a bird's wings, soaring over time and space, praying and praising with your heart in your feet.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Well, if there are no more questions, Rebecca, I would like to thank you for joining us today. It was terrific. You did a great job and very informative, very interesting. Give us a lot to think about and write about, hopefully. So until we meet again, the fourth Saturday in July, and I will put out, Michelle will get some information to me that I will put into a letter and send out to everybody in a week or so. And until we meet again, everybody,
thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye-bye.
Bye.